Thank you very much, and thank you everyone for including me in this conference. It's been fascinating. Injustice, frustration, a sense of powerlessness start me in a direction. Initially, I look at art, photographs, videos, but primarily I read until a concept begins to form. Then the painter takes over. It's through a visual language that is intricately bound up with material, paint, charcoal, chalk, pumice, tar, canvas, paper, that ideas and concepts fuse in equal measure and are transformed. This nonverbal language falls into the space between ideas, discourse, and analysis, and illuminates something else. It defamiliarizes things as they are known, as Victor Shklovsky would say, and through this process allows us to shift perspective and perceive differently. The tactility of this material is a locus for feeling. My work has two poles, one concerned with beauty and art and nature and its border with decay and death, and the other with war. The three completed series of my paintings and drawings that I will show today, and a fourth that I have only recently begun, all look at an aspect or a result of war and or terrorism, either its explosion or its implosion. The first two series, The Fires of War from the Gulf War, which is this, and 9/11, zeroed in on cataclysmic events, each a volcanic scale eruption of symbolic power. Through the media, the images made immediately visual to the world the power to disrupt. In the case of 9/11, the media was the message. The second two series, Abu Ghraib, Abuse of Power, and In Our Name, Black Sites in Guantanamo, look more at what can and will happen when power is unbridled with no checks in a system that has made instruments of government invisible, resulting in loss of humanity and erosion of law. And the outcome for America has been an implosion, a turning in on itself, an internalization of itself as the enemy. Fires of War. In 1991, we witnessed the bombing of Baghdad on CNN. The dazzling trajectory of missiles and bombs streaked like shooting stars across the night skies of the city and our TV screens, blunting the horror that the mean age in Baghdad was 15. It was a city of children orphaned by the Iran-Iraq War. Saddam Hussein's detonation of the Kuwaiti oil fields alarmed scientists. Carl Sagan warned that such an extensive conflagration could cause a nuclear winter, or at best a major regional disaster. Luck prevailed. If it had not, the region, including Iraq, would have been ecologically decimated. My involvement began with the excessive force of the U.S.-inspired bombing of Baghdad and Bush's impatience to go to war for oil, and it grew to include a deep concern for the fate of the earth. The Pentagon used the media to run the war, both for military strategy and propaganda. Newspaper publishers and TV news executives abnegated their right to freedom of the press, allowing their reporters to be pooled, kept away from the action, very selectively embedded, and effectively sidelined and controlled. A sanitized language of war appeared and was incorporated by the press. Collateral damage, in this case, meant civilian deaths. To neutralize was to kill. To visit something was to bomb it. And the bombs were smart bombs that didn't hit people. The press and the government created a buffer zone of language between reality and the responsibility. When the oil wells blew, the image, the metaphor, and a connection to landscape painting in my distant artistic past came together. I tried to work off images from the media, but it became apparent that by its very nature, what I was seeing had to be experienced. Several months after the end of the war, I traveled to Kuwait and spent 2 weeks in the burning oil fields. I joined one of the firefighting crews from Boots and Coots and traveled through the Burgan fields, the largest of the oil fields, with the chemical engineer and the safety director for the cleanup. Nearly all of the 700 wells that had been detonated were still either burning or gushing oil onto the desert, forming huge lakes. From the smoke plume, the skies were like the blackest night, 24 hours a day. The fires sounded like squadrons of jets taking off, and their deafening roar was punctuated by the explosion of bomblets and cluster bombs. The fires shifted with the winds. The roads that were open one moment were covered with oil and flame the next. One day we spent 8 hours trying to get out of the fields. Every road was blocked by fire. Tar rained from the sky, and the one time I got out of the vehicle to take a picture, my shoes got stuck in the tar and had to be pried out. The stench was of burning tires, and it was 120 degrees in the shade. Even in this surreal world of fire and tar, where nothing looked like anything I'd ever seen before, there were moments when the history of art flickered past. Goya, John Martin, Turner, Otto Dix, and Anselm Kiefer. But most of the time, it was post-apocalyptic. Mad Max meets Alice in Wonderland and Dante's Inferno. I took over 1,000 photographs, but they could not capture the 360 degrees of fire, the total surround of flame, smoke, and darkness, and the chimera of time, space, and gravity. The photographs gave me a huge amount of detail, but the structure of my painting was based on composites that I made from sketches made in the studio. I used the materials of the burning fields to make the fire paintings: pumice for texture, charcoal, oil stick, tar, and oil paint. Beyond irony, these materials became a vehicle for the sensory overload I experienced in the field: smell, sound, taste, temperature, color. Whether by music, dance, or painting, art has a way to make use of limited materials. To bring the viewer into the painting, I skewered the perspective and inverted the planes and shifted scale. I used multiple points of view to break into the horizon line in an effort to disrupt our comfort zone and to destabilize both vision and equilibrium. Aftermath, which is 7 by 20 feet, goes a step further. It is painted, so to speak, inside out, so that the reflections in the lake of oil mirror what must be in our space, thus creating a virtual surround. And this one is 40 feet and really often is shown on a corner, which gives a lot of that feeling of surround. None of the works are much more than 7 feet high, so that our entry into them is of human scale, although the largest, this one, is 7 by 40 feet. Each work can be seen alone, but the impact is far greater and approximates more fully the experience of conflagration as far as the eye can see when many of them are seen together. 9/11. On 9/11, there was a sky so blue, bluer than blue, the perfect autumn day. Within an hour, the world as we in America had known it changed. The collapse of the World Trade Center harkened to the instability of the global world we now lived in, and our vulnerability as its consequence. Without belaboring the point, the penetration and explosion of the World Trade Center as well as the exploding oil wells can be seen as images of male power. With the expanded global technology, the World Trade Center images were intended to be and were seen instantaneously around the world. The methods of warfare, if not exactly new, had been mutating into virulent forms where it takes a smaller and smaller number of people to create an inordinate amount of damage, the scope of which had previously been the arena of armies against armies. My 9/11 series shows the precariousness and instability by recreating the spaces of vulnerability, the spaces and indeterminate states of between impact and explosion, between the breaking and apart and the falling, between the crashing to the ground and the subsequent rising, between life and death. As with the Gulf War, I collected images from diverse sources. I worked off video and TV, which allowed me to catch consecutive moments that become almost like a vibration of the movement of dust, cloud, debris, where they are suspended in free fall in the interstices of time, space, and memory. In the more abstract images, which defamiliarize the familiar, there is the ghostly impression of architectural structures and rubble. The feel of what was there is no longer as it transmutes from one state to the other. To do this, I used charcoal, pastel, and paper because of their transitory and fugitive qualities. The powdery material of these drawings evokes disintegration and ash. The way light sits on the chalky surface reinforces the mobility of each moment and each mark. The support of stretcher bar and canvas was too heavy and grounded, so I used paper for its fragility, powdered pigments instead of paint to get the feeling of dusty surfaces and particle-filled space. I used the paper in grids or diptychs to create tension between the structure and the chaos of collapse. The photograph was used as a kind of counterpoint to fleeting memory, against the inevitable destabilization of destruction. Sometimes the splatter on the lens of the camera polka dots the surface of the drawing. Other times the glare of the flash of the TV screen obliterates part of the image. The camera is inevitably there, recording like Madame Defarge. First the flight, then the procession of people leaving the remains of the World Trade Center marked another state. Having barely escaped death themselves, but having literally experienced the death of others in the most physical way, through the breath, they were dwelling in the horror of it. Abu Ghraib, abuse of power. In response to 9/11, the United States declared a war on terror with an amorphous enemy that had no homeland, and it is a war with no end. When the Abu Ghraib photos leaked out, then burst into the media, they bore into our consciousness as well. The wrenching photographic images of inflicted pain and humiliation ruptured the fabric of America's mythology of itself as the moral force and promoter of democratic values in the world. Depicted in these photographs were multiple forms of torture and abuse, often in pornographic poses made for the camera. The prisoners are publicly and in the presence of women against the tenets of Islam, submitted to devastating humiliation. They are choreographed sexually into sexually compromising and often homoerotic pyramids of human flesh, hung in stress positions beyond the dislocation of limbs, threatened by dogs, maimed, waterboarded, and occasionally murdered. In these tableaus and reality TV videos made for the internet, both male and female soldiers assume stances of dominance and display the victory thumbs up as they preside over the pain and degradation of the detainees. Although the United States had long crusaded internationally against human rights violations, since the 1950s, the CIA has been training many of the Latin and Central American death squads at the SOA School of the Americas in Panama. In fact, its manual, the Kubark Manual for Counterintelligence Interrogation, has been one of the blueprints for the interrogation methods we have seen at Abu Ghraib and Guantanamo. Reading the Red Cross testimonies gave me the clue as to how to approach these loaded snapshots. The accounts of the hapless, confused, and abused released detainees who just couldn't understand why America would do this to them were heartbreaking. There was a visual asymmetry of power between the soldiers taking the pictures, who cruelly derided and mocked them, and the prisoners' words that were so vulnerable and human. When the body is subjected to torture, the protection of the skin dissolves, and the self no longer has a safe container. It is afloat, defenseless, and unmoored. In drawing, erasing, redrawing, and reworking, I've struggled to find the exact angle of stress or the precise curve of tension. In this struggle, I discovered that the white chalk line illuminates this out-of-bodiness and this precarious relationship to the self. The bodies were like the ash-covered figures escaping the World Trade Center, the body shells from Pompeii, or the chalk outlines that mark the place of the dead at a crime scene. The emptiness of the sheet of paper is a metaphor for imprisonment, with no context, where the prisoners are hooded or blindfolded. They have no perception of where one thing begins or another ends, a spatial hell. I used grayed out or muted colored papers to increase the institutional bareness of the space, the chill and dullness of the cement prison floor. The frame of the empty page is like the cell or the cage itself. The figures brush against its limit, the edge. I show the disparity between the prisoners who appear naked and fragile, often deprived of sight, and the interrogators who are physically massive with layers of clothes, boots, vests, and excess flesh. The soldiers are accompanied by the accoutrements of power, the gloved hand, the leash, the painful shackles, and their attack dogs. I zoom in on these objects of pain and control to bring them to our awareness. Power resides in the right of the interrogators to see and be seen, both their right to surveillance and the right to be photographed with their human trophies, whether alive or dead. The fact that these images are based on photos is important. The photos are the record of what happened. I reframe them and retake the same shot, so to speak, close in on a detail or shift the angle or perspective so that we feel from within what we observed from outside. We become aware through perspective and cropping that the scene has been orchestrated, staged. The scene was meant to be photographed. The photographer and we, the viewers, are seeing the same thing and are brought into an intimate relationship with abuse. We are looking over the photographer's shoulder and are complicit as both witness and voyeurs of this awful scene. The depiction of suffering and torture is a central theme of Western art, and integral to that theme is the artist's attempt to find a visual form through which the viewer can identify or empathize with that suffering. Mantegna's Lamentation over the Dead Christ, Antonello Damascene's Christ Crowned with Thorns, Picasso's Guernica. The Abu Ghraib photos are particularly disturbing since they were taken with the intent not to have an empathic connection to the suffering of the prisoner, to the horror of it all, but are meant to show his weakness in the face of might. Photos and digital images have become such a part of the fast expendable information age we live in that they have created a glut where the sheer mass and volume of this information has made the eye the most overused sense, often inured to feeling. Through the reduction of means using simple charcoal, chalk, or paper, I try to expose pain. Tactility and the sense of touch can stimulate the eye to see and feel afresh. In Our Name, Black Sites, Guantanamo. Here we have an image of an innocent man. We've missed one. That's it. Here we have an image of an innocent man standing on tiptoes for 3 hours with water up to his chin in a black site in Cairo, rendered to there by us. I'm just beginning this new series in Our Name, Black Sites in Guantanamo. I'm working with a clay-based paint, charcoal and pastel on large paper. The works generally are about twice the height of the Abu Ghraib drawings. The prisoners are all life-size. Since photographs have not been released, as they were with Abu Ghraib, I'm constructing the images from my reading, interviews with released prisoners and their lawyers, reports from ACLU, Center for Constitutional Rights, the Red Cross, Inspector General. I'm trying to piece together a picture of how and what happened to these men. In Our Name is in part a response to the Obama administration's continuing endorsement of an indefinite detention for suspected terrorists without due process. And it appears that this indefinite detention could apply to the United States citizen as well. Gone is habeas corpus, gone is the Third Geneva Convention. Many hundreds of the detainees who ended up in Guantanamo were innocent and have subsequently been released after 5, 6, 7 years in prison, having never been charged with a crime or tried. In Iraq, they have often been picked up in sweeps of neighborhoods where men of a certain age were profiled and hauled off to prison for no crime, simply on speculation to be worked up and over into the mosaic theory that everyone knows something if pushed far enough. Once in the system, they often ended up in Guantanamo. The CIA, which had little or no experience with interrogation, took over at Guantanamo. The FBI's more moderate and more successful approach to interrogation was scrapped. Under pressure from the White House to get information at any cost, the CIA contracted 2 psychologist experts in learned helplessness who had run SEER, the Survival, Evasion, and Resistance Escape program, that trained military men how to withstand torture if captured. They cobbled together a plan for the CIA, although they had never interrogated anyone and knew nothing about the Middle East. Guantanamo became a laboratory where CIA interrogators worked with psychologists and doctors. They maintained daily, if not hourly, contact with high-level officials in Washington, walking a tightrope as to how they could legally torture. And the new twisted definition of torture had become organ failure or death. At Guantanamo, there were 2 distinctly different methods of torture. First, there was long-term procedures to extract information, a combination of psychological and physical torture. A prisoner could be in solitary confinement for months or years on end, subjected to every imaginable form of assault, be it sensory, excess, or deprivation. Excess of blaring music, heat, cold, lights on 24 hours a day, deprivation of sleep, daylight, exercise, solid food, and medical treatment. Detainees were kept naked and shackled in freezing cells days on end. The taking away and giving back of the prisoners' few items, toilet paper, soap, clothing, bedding, had become part of the psychology of breaking them. As with Abu Ghraib, there were the damaging stress positions and sexual humiliation as well. Add to this forced feeding for those on hunger strikes, where the overly large feeding tubes were yanked out of one detainee's throat and reused, still covered with blood and pus on the next. A kind of covert sexual abuse took place in the form of official body cavity searches, mock executions were performed, and finally there were those who committed suicide or were killed during or from interrogations. The second brand of torture was off the books, meant to restrain unruly prisoners, but in fact was used commonly for punishment and intimidation for infractions as small as having 2 styrofoam cups instead of the 1 allowed. The extreme reaction force teams, known as ERF or ERF teams, were made up of 5 soldiers who stormed the cell and sprayed it upon entry with mace. They wore full armor, masks, carried shields. These squads swooped in like avenging angels. They may throw the prisoner to the ground, shackle or hog-tie him, hold open his eyes and spray more directly into them, punch, break noses, urinate on his head, and continually flush his head in the toilet, another form of waterboarding. According to Jeremy Scahill, who had reported on this widely, the incidents of ERFing have increased at Guantanamo since Barack Obama came into office. With these once illegal, always immoral, but now standard operating procedures that manipulate the law and codify forms of excessive abuse, we are seeing our country become the very thing it vows to abhor. This, in turn, gives permission to civic society to follow suit. We are finding social institutions of all stripes, from the federal government to the school systems, becoming the site of excessive force. The people have become the target of this internalized anger and fear of loss of control on the part of the institutions that run the country, and they have turned on their own constituency. We have seen this with the violence and force used against peaceful demonstrators and activist groups across the country, with the government spying on its own citizens and with the presidential executive orders that could send anyone to jail. The sweeps in Iraq that scooped up and sent to prison thousands of innocent people are akin to the sweeps used in both Republican conventions against peaceful demonstrators, with a strong move towards the criminalization of protest. The INS used the same method to pick up non-criminal illegal immigrants who have spent months and even years in detention facilities that resemble Guantanamo prison. There they are treated just like the detainees, including long stints up to 60 days in solitary confinement for minor protests about food or lack of medical care. Cities across the country are passing laws to criminalize the poor, according to Barbara Ehrenreich. Brutal force in unwarranted situations is reminiscent on a lesser scale of the ERF teams at Guantanamo. All the following items in newspapers or blogs have come across my computer in the last month without my doing a search for them. Reports of tasering by the police, always for small, insignificant infractions, for the most part. Syracuse, New York, a pregnant woman with 2 children, picked up for going 5 miles over the speed limit, tasered to the ground, cuffed and dragged off to the police station, leaving her 2 children alone in the car, resisting arrest. Travis County, Texas, a grandmother tasered to the ground for refusing to sign a ticket she felt was unjustified, disorderly conduct. Idaho, a taser put up a man's ass, threatening to zap his balls, on tape, similar sounding to accounts of rapes with broom handles at Guantanamo. Some schools are now allowed to use 50,000 volts of tasers on children. The schools also insist that millions of our children be drugged if they veer slightly from the norm, what we might have called feisty or spirited in the past. And this is not even to mention or go into the major institutions of finance, insurance, health, and the government with special emphasis on FEMA. In conclusion, my works explore the sensory and experiential nature of violence, war, and torture, as distinct from its conceptual and historical dimensions. The cost of human aggression in all forms of warfare is very high, and the potential for it to implode on itself is great. Globally, nationally, personally, we are in a state of flux. Technological changes have sped up time and collapsed space. The power and violence of nations at home and abroad has only grown. Art may or may not change anything in the moment, but it can have an effect as history. And for me as an artist, here and now, it is necessary to point, and then to go beyond documenting, to bring the transformative power of the visual to bear on what there is to be seen, understood, and felt. Thank you.